everyone. This is Veronica Kirilenko of the New American Magazine. We're here in Orlando, Florida, attending the Conservative Political Action Committee, speaking to interesting people. One of them is Vivek Ramaswamy. And Vivek, thank you for being here.
Yeah, glad to join. How you doing?
Good, thank you. So Vivek, I know that you're a very successful businessman, entrepreneur, and you recently just stepped down as a CEO of a very high-profile pharmaceutical company to address the issue that you called a cultural cancer. Please tell us what's going on.
Yeah, so look, I had the privilege of living the American dream. My parents came to this country as immigrants with almost no money, and I had the chance to found a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. That's what the American dream's all about. And I began to worry that there was a new cultural cancer, not a biological cancer, but a cultural cancer that threatened to kill that dream. And it is a cultural philosophy that says that your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation, full stop. That if you're black, you're inherently disadvantaged. That if you're white, you're inherently privileged. No matter your economic background or upbringing, by the way, your race and your gender govern who you are and the thoughts and ideas you're allowed to have. And to me, that defied Martin Luther King's dream from 60 years ago, where he said that we should be judged not on the color of our skin, but on the content of our character. It defied the very dream that allowed me to achieve everything I ever had in my life. And I thought it was actually going to threaten the essence of what it means to be American itself. Yet very few people were willing to talk in the open about it, because if you disagree with the core claims of this new religion, and I do think it's a religion, you're automatically labeled as a racist, actually. And the capital R word, as I call it, is actually created this new culture of fear. I mean, there's no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist. So if you disagree with this philosophy and you're called a racist, then that actually creates a new culture of fear that replaces our culture of free speech as Americans. And to me, that's why I actually was motivated to make this the calling for the next chapter of my career after being a biotech CEO, to recognize that part of living in a democracy isn't just the votes you cast every November. It is living in a society where people feel free to say what they actually think in public. And I couldn't remember a time in my life where there was a bigger gap between what people were willing to say in private and what people were willing to say in public. And I thought that was an indictment of the health of American democracy. And I wanted to do my part to at least speak out openly in an unfiltered way, in a way that was authentic, that I couldn't do as a CEO of a high-profile company. And that's why I stepped back as CEO to write the book I did and to work on the problems I've been working on over the last year.
Vivek, but how did it start for you? Did it start with some incidents, maybe when you seen the freedom of speech of some concrete person was infringed upon? How did it start for you? How did you get inspired? How did you awake?
Yeah, well, interesting use of that word. So, look, I think that there wasn't one event, but I'll give you one example. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal arguing that actually we should disentangle capitalism from democracy, that we should get politics out of business and business out of politics. If you're running a business, you should provide excellent products and services. If you're in government, you should focus on passing laws and setting good policies. We don't want the two to mix. That was what I wrote. It was a one and done in February 2020. An agent approached me afterward and said, "Hey, you want to make that a book?" I said, "Hey, I've never written a book. Maybe that'd be fun. I'd write a book." Well, what I recognized was that the more I started writing about these topics, and then I started writing more regularly for the Wall Street Journal, the more controversial it became in the context of our culture. So last January, and it was a heated environment after January 6th in 2021, but I wrote an op-ed that argued against big tech censorship. I made a legal argument that said that if government was working in coordination with private companies to censor content, then that I was actually bound by the Constitution. I co-wrote it with a former law professor of mine, and that was that. Well, what happened actually in the wake of that is that several advisors actually resigned. Several advisors to my company resigned. I talk about this in my book a little bit. And to me, that was a wake-up call to say that actually I wasn't really free to speak my mind as a citizen. I wasn't wearing my hat as a CEO. I was speaking as a citizen. But that actually was the wake-up call for me to recognize that if I wasn't free to do that as a CEO, imagine how everyday Americans feel who might operate for fear of putting food on the dinner table. And then I look at the number of people who were fired last year for wearing the hat of the wrong presidential candidate to work. And to me, that wasn't America, irrespective of which presidential candidate they were supporting. America wasn't a place that forced you to choose between the American dream and the First Amendment, between speaking your mind freely and putting food on the dinner table. We're the nation that allows you to do both of those things at the same time without having to apologize for it. And when I felt that part of our identity was under attack as Americans, that was really the wake-up call to me to say that, if I wasn't going to do it, then I wasn't sure who else was going to be able to take much greater risks for being able to do the same thing. And so I did my part and not only wrote the book, but have ultimately been speaking out about these issues across the country over the last year.
Vivek, how do you think, you mentioned that this phenomena is profoundly anti-American, but how could such an anti-American idea could take root here in the land of the free at all?
Yeah, well, I think that there are institutional forces at work. So one of the things I talk about is in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, what you saw in this country was actually big business viewed themselves as the bad guy. The public didn't like big business. They realized that actually the threat to their power used to come from the left. What they could do is now use their power to advance the values of the left to be able to ultimately deflect accountability from both the left and the right. So the liberals now love corporate power used in favor of advancing their own woke values because they like the values that they're pushing. But conservatives are also duped into submission because their inner conscience tells them that the free market can do no wrong without recognizing that the free market they idealize does not actually exist today. And so that's how both sides are duped into submission by the rise of this new monster that I call the woke industrial complex. It is a combination of government power and corporate power that is far more powerful than either one alone. And that's the vector, if you will, for actually pushing this new dogma and making it mainstream. It used to be an idea in the academy, critical race theory. That's fine. I think all ideas should be discussed in the marketplace of ideas in our universities. I'm okay with that. But when it went from being about a philosophy that was about challenging the system to actually becoming the system was when corporate America got involved. And I think there's even more cynical forces at work today with respect to China now getting in on the act and recognizing that they can get corporations to criticize the United States without saying a peep about actual human rights atrocities in China, which now then create a false moral equivalence between China and the US. And so anyway, to answer your question, the answer is, when did it actually become mainstream? It's when cynical institutional forces got involved, including both corporate forces and geopolitical forces. That's part of how we got to where we are.
How do we fight against it?
Yeah, so this is I think the most important question of our time. I think it requires a conservative movement to wake up to the fact that the biggest threats to liberty and prosperity in our country today are not just from big government. That is only half the story. It's this new merger of government power and corporate power. But I think we need solutions that cause conservatives to rethink their dogmas too. For example, I think we should have a conversation about making political expression or political belief a civil right in this country. To say that if you can't discriminate against somebody because they're black or gay or Muslim or white or Christian or Jewish or whatever, you should not be able to discriminate against them just because they're an outspoken conservative or an outspoken liberal either. That's part of what it means to be American. Now, conservative orthodoxy historically says that the free market should be able to work this stuff out, that we shouldn't impose another constraint that ultimately impedes what businesses can and can't do. I say, okay, that could be a reasonable answer, but you can't have it both ways. To say that we're both going to have protected classes, to say that you can't fire somebody on account of their race, religion, national origin, or sexual orientation, but somehow you can fire them for expressing themselves politically, you can't have it both ways. And actually, some of those very civil rights laws, when they're interpreted through the lens of jurisprudence since then in the courts that say that disparate impact on group-based identity can be a basis for inferring discrimination, those actually create what I call the deep corporate apparatuses, the HR bureaucracies, the human resources bureaucracies, and so forth, that administer these civil rights statutes, allegedly, when actually creating the very conditions for political discrimination that we see today, while leaving political belief unprotected. Okay, so as I know there's a lot there, but the bottom line is, to make it really simple, if you're going to say that you can't discriminate against somebody because of race, gender, sexual orientation, or religion, then consider adding to that the fact that you can't discriminate on account of your political beliefs either. That's an example of how we can use, policymaking to revive a culture of free speech. But I don't think the answer is just policymaking. I think there's also answers in the private sector too, where I think there's 100 million Americans today or more who are hungry for new businesses that stand for these basic American values. Not right-wing values, but actual fundamental American values, universalist ideas like a belief in the American dream, like a belief in free speech and expression, like a belief in capitalism as a system to lift people up. And I think that if business leaders and entrepreneurs are brave enough to step up and capture that opportunity, then I think that they're actually not only going to, be very successful by doing it, but we're going to see a cultural pendulum ultimately brought back and restoring a depoliticized private sector through using the market forces to ultimately get there as well. So I'm actually quite optimistic about that, more optimistic about that than I am about political change.
Good, so are we. That was Vivek Ramaswamy. Thank you very much for your time, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.